Live NFL trivia every Wednesday night on Twitch at 9 p.m. Eastern. Come show off your football knowledge for a chance to win cash prizes. Check the link in the description to find out more. And now, on with our feature presentation. Think of the most intense in-state rivalries between two teams not in the same conference. And odds are, one of the first rivalries that will pop into your head is the rivalry between these two schools right here. The Clemson Tigers and the South Carolina Gamecocks. To say that these two schools hate each other and care deeply about this rivalry would be a massive understatement, as the two schools separated by 130 some odd miles absolutely despise each other. And though the rivalry has largely gone Clemson's way recently, with the Tigers having won 7 of the last 8 meetings, that's not to say that there haven't been some iconic moments in the history of this rivalry. From Jerry Butler's iconic diving catch in 1977 to win the game for Clemson, to Rod Gardner's 50-yard controversial catch in 2000 with 10 seconds left to set Clemson up for the game-winning field goal, to the infamous brawl in 2004 that left both schools opting not to play in bowl games. So I think it's safe to say that people care about this rivalry a lot. Which is why it seems like, as a broadcasting company, it's a bad idea to not just imply, but explicitly say that no one cares about this rivalry, and that you're not going to televise the game because of it. That seems like a really stupid and short-sighted thing to do, right? Well, during this meeting right here in 1995, that's exactly what Jefferson-Pilot decided to do, when they opted, for some inexplicable reason, to not televise the annual rivalry game between Clemson and South Carolina. And to say that outrage ensued because of it would be putting it incredibly lightly. Because this is the story behind what has to be, without a doubt, in the over 125-year history of the rivalry, the craziest broadcasting controversy in Clemson and South Carolina history. Before I talk about the controversy in question and why it even happened in the first place, we need some context to understand the importance of this game, as well as what Jefferson-Pilot's original plan was when it came to broadcasting it. It's November 18th, 1995, and it's that time of year again, as it's the regular season finale between the Clemson Tigers and the South Carolina Gamecocks. Aside from the obvious rivalry aspect of it, this was an especially big game for Clemson in particular, as they entered this game with a 7-3 record, having won 4 straight games. This meant that the Tigers found themselves inside the top 25 of the AP poll, sitting at number 24. If they could win this game, then they would stay inside the top 25 of the poll going into bowl season, which would have been nice, especially after a 1994 season that was largely a disappointment, where they ended with a losing record. On top of that, a win would pretty much clinch a spot in a bowl game. Not that their bowl status was in too much doubt as the third-place team in the conference. Fans all across the state, just like always, were getting ready and were getting geared up to watch this contest on television, as they had done just about every year for the last decade. You could always bet on the fact that Clemson, South Carolina was going to be shown on TV. Jefferson-Pilot had televised the game every year since the start of the 1990s, and with the exception of 1989, when the game was on ESPN, had televised the game throughout the late 80s. So the 1995 installment was going to be no exception, and was going to be business as usual, right? Yeah, not quite. Because as the official TV station of both the ACC and the SEC, Jefferson-Pilot made the decision for the November 18th slate of games to regionally televise the action based on where you were across the East Coast. That meant that at 12:30, depending on where you were, you'd either get the game between Florida and Vanderbilt, the game between Tennessee and Kentucky, the game between Duke and North Carolina, or the game between Maryland and Florida State. Alright, that seems like a pretty sound strategy. Especially back in 1995, college football was highly regionalized, and with the exception of bowl games, some rivalries like Ohio State-Michigan, and big games between top teams that had national championship implications, generally speaking, fans didn't care a whole lot about games involving teams that weren't in their area. Regionally splitting up the games was a commonplace strategy to maximize ratings. However, you might have noticed that of the 4 games that Jefferson-Pilot was planning on airing that day, that there was one game that I did not mention. And that was, as you might have been able to tell, the Clemson South Carolina game. Because Jefferson-Pilot decided not to televise the game at all. And I don't mean not televise it across the country or across the coast, but televise it in South Carolina, where the game is going to receive a ton of attention. I mean that they decided not to televise it, period. Even if you were in the Palmetto State, you were straight out of luck. Unless you were at the game, there was no way to watch this in-state battle. And as you can expect, people were naturally and understandably upset about this. They were not able to watch their team play in their biggest game of the season, especially since there was an expectation that the game would air on TV. And there was no way that anything like this was foreseeable, especially since at the time that the announcement was made in mid-November, roughly a week and a half before the game, there was still a chance that the game would have bowl implications for South Carolina. Now, it was time for Jefferson-Pilot to face the music and explain their rationale. And if they said something along the lines of, "We wanted to televise this game, but it just wasn't feasible to do so, because even though this rivalry is important and we understand how much people care about it, from what this game means in terms of bowl implications and the national championship outlook, the other 4 games were more important, and we don't have the ability, from a monetary or a technological standpoint, to broadcast 5 games. Then fine. It wouldn't make Clemson or South Carolina fans feel any better, but fine. If they said something like, "We've televised the game for the last 5 years, and the ratings were not very good. We were losing money every time we televised it," then okay. Again, it's not going to make Clemson or South Carolina fans feel any better about this decision, but at least there's a justification that makes sense. Instead, Jefferson-Pilot decided to go about this in quite literally the worst way possible, almost rubbing it in their faces. This is a prime example of how not to do PR and how not to communicate with the public when you make a controversial decision. Because in announcing that the game would not be seen on TV, Jimmy Rayburn, the program director, said, "In every other state, I don't think they give a hoot. This is of interest in South Carolina. Period." Now, I completely get that to justify why the game isn't being shown in other states, but this doesn't answer the question of why you couldn't televise the game in South Carolina. If the game is of interest in South Carolina, and you have the option to regionally televise the game in South Carolina, then why aren't you doing that? It's like if in the NFL, CBS decides not to televise the game between the Houston Texans and the Jacksonville Jaguars anywhere in the country, and they say no one besides people in Houston or Jacksonville cares about that game, but don't answer why they're not televising it in either Houston or Jacksonville. If you admit that the game is important locally, and you did, you have the option to air it locally, which you do, and you choose not to without justifying it or giving a reason for it, that doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense now, does it? But it gets worse. Rayburn said on the fans, they won't understand. We're in a no-win situation for that state. And in the most laughable and insulting part of it all, said that instead of being upset, Clemson and South Carolina fans should feel grateful that they've had the game on TV every year since 1986. Don't cry because it's over. Smile because it happened. There are people in third world countries who would dream of even being able to watch their favorite college football team on TV once, let alone every year for close to a decade. How dare you be upset when you got to see this game from the comfort of your couch for a decade? Look at everything we've done for you that we didn't have to do, even though we kind of did as the official TV partner of the ACC and the SEC. And now, the one time we decide to do something else, you want to attack us? You can see why this is quite literally the worst possible thing you could have said, right? This is PR 101 in what not to do. Justifying your decision by saying that fans are spoiled and by saying, "I don't want to hear it because you guys have had it good," is absolutely horrible and makes you seem incompetent. especially when televising these games is quite literally your job. It would be one thing if Jefferson-Pilot was televising these games out of the goodness of their hearts, but when your job is to broadcast games, people pay money to get your games, people are reliant on you broadcasting the games, and you don't televise the games, you can't be upset when people are upset. And as you can imagine, the outrage was insane across the state. But the outrage reached new levels when the news got to WIS-TV, the NBC affiliate in Columbia, and got to Joe Daggett, the lead sports broadcaster for the station. Because Daggett decided that this decision from Jefferson-Pilot needed to be mass protested by the people. And thus, on the air, when Daggett broke the news, he gave out the telephone number for Jefferson-Pilot and told all fans to call that number repeatedly and voice their concerns. Even though South Carolina and Clemson fans usually hated each other, on this day, they had to unite for a common cause. And while the outrage was already bad before this, once Daggett said the phone number of Jefferson-Pilot live on the air, it was as though the floodgates opened up. Because at that point, all of the lines for Jefferson-Pilot were jammed. And at that point, hearing the outrage and seeing the disruption that people across the state were doing to their business, Jefferson-Pilot had no choice but to reverse course and televise the 1995 edition of the Clemson South Carolina game. And this wasn't a long thought out decision. This change of heart was not even 48 hours after the original announcement. This was Jefferson-Pilot admitting, yeah, we messed up, and we definitely should not have put out that statement saying fans should be grateful and that no one cares about the game. Because clearly, a lot of people did. As Rayburn said, it would be stupid for me to say that those calls had nothing to do with it. All I will say is we responded to the calls, and it will be on television. The last time the game wasn't on TV was in 1986, and at least for 1995, that streak was going to continue, even though it looked incredibly dicey for a moment. Because now, while nothing changed with the 4 games that Jefferson-Pilot was going to televise across the East Coast, if you were in South Carolina, you were now going to get the added 5th game between the Tigers and the Gamecocks. As for how this game turned out, as you can tell from these highlights you've been watching this whole time, the game was a convincing victory for the Tigers. After losing the game in humiliating fashion the year before, losing 33-7 on their home field to clinch a losing record, they returned the favor and got their revenge in 1995, as they beat the Gamecocks by a final score of 38-17. And even though South Carolina jumped out to a 17-10 lead, it was all for nothing, as Clemson scored the final 28 points of the game, running away with it in the end. It was a great way for Clemson to end a great bounce-back year following that disappointing 1994 campaign on so many levels. And the good news was that everyone in the state, if they wanted to, got to see it, even if it took a lot of convincing, and even if it was way harder than it probably should have been. Because in 1995, Jefferson-Pilot found out the hard way that the requests of the viewers were the true pilots of the airwaves. Get your official Jaguar Gear 9 merchandise by going to jg9shop.com, and be sure to like this video, ring the notification bell, and subscribe down below if you haven't already, as it helps the channel out a lot. And be sure to check out Twitch every Wednesday night at 9 p.m. Eastern for your chance to play NFL trivia and win cash prizes. Link in the description below. Also, special thanks to all of our Patreon supporters for helping out the channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. So you can become a patron and request future video topics in the description below.